Crikey, what a state.
Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. Welcome to the channel if this is your first time. This is my next book that is part of a project started by MJ at Reading This Life, which is about reading and celebrating and exploring and discussing banned books. So this is the fifth book, I think it is, in this series. So this is also another George Orwell one. So the last one I read for this project was Animal Farm, but I'm jumping on to this one partly because it was a very quick reread because I've only just read it again. I've read this about 4 or 5 times, and I studied it at school. It's a really important book. It's a really, really important book. I thought it would be crazy to do this project and not cover this book. So I'm talking about George Orwell's 1984, and this book is it's just become part of our culture. It's one of the most famous books of all time, and it deserves its fame, its status, its place in our society. It was written in 1949, and it was actually George Orwell's last book. So he actually died before he could see the success that the book would get, which is such a shame because he was such an interesting man and was so politically driven and politically aware and had so much experience in the different places he'd been to, and that had sort of created his political attitude. It would have been amazing to find out what he would have thought if he'd lived into his 80s and then gone into the 80s, because he basically died in his 40s, in his mid-40s. So he didn't live a very long life. So it is a little bit of a shame. Well, a massive shame. But yeah, 1984 was his last book. You do get the feeling that it's such a masterpiece that you could say that he might have just written essays after that and not necessarily written something else or written something completely different. You know, it feels like this is his definitive statement about politics, maybe. It might be that he might have written, if he'd have lasted into the 70s and 80s, maybe he'd have written something that was like post-Cold War. I don't know. But he did die young, so this was his last book, and it's an incredible piece of work that is so complete. It's got so many ideas in it. It's one of those things you can constantly refer back to. It is referred to all the time in our society, so sometimes in a casual way. You know, people that don't necessarily know the book very well might go on about, oh, Big Brother is watching us, or they might say, oh, it's like 1984, or you know, they might make references to it that they might not be as aware as someone else who will dissect it and talk about this influence on other literature, as well as the references you see today to what Orwell's talking about. Because Orwell was depicting a future for him. It was written in 1949, so it was set in 1984. So it was a future that he was describing as a nightmare. It's a very clear dystopian future. It's a society that no one would want to live under, and it's a massive warning, and it's his big statement against totalitarianism. So as I said in the video I did about Animal Farm, there was a quote I read out where he said that something like everything he's written after his experience in Spain has been an attempt to rally against totalitarianism and write for democratic socialism. So that was his general motivation, but it's such a complete piece of work that it goes beyond that, and it just so many different people from different areas of the political spectrum would agree that this book depicts a nightmare. So I think that's partly because people from different parts of the right and left are still generally against totalitarianism and against fascism. There are sadly fascist people and fascist parties around now, some gaining popularity, and that is why this book is so relevant and so important, because people who believe in fascist ideologies can use persuasive language to completely ignore the reality of a fascist state. And it's quite scary, the fact that there are situations now in Europe as well as in America where people are kind of blindly seeing the positive side to something that is basically fascist, and it's quite scary, really. So it's a really important book from the point of view of not being dated. Sadly, it's not relevant anymore. Sadly, it is relevant. So in the book, he depicts a society that had developed in a way that in the 1950s, World War III had happened, and nuclear bombs were used in this war, and hit the UK, hit loads of different countries. But the main character, Winston Smith, is living in the UK. He's living in London, and basically, the Soviet Union become massively expansionist, and there's this sort of imperialist drive that I think comes from Orwell's opinion of Stalin. Although, yeah, that's another subject. I might do a video on Stalin, I don't know. And the US, the UK, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand, and Canada become Oceania. So that's one area of the world that's divided. The world divided up into three parts thanks to this World War III. Oceania is those countries. So that's America, UK, Canada, South Africa, New Zealand, and Australia. That's Oceania. And China and the Soviet Union, they unite to become Eurasia, and then the different countries in East Asia combine to become East Asia. So those are like the three big divisions in the world, and those divisions are also seen as enemies, which I'll get to in a minute. But there's this civil war that happens, and that's kind of how the world is divided after that. And these countries are perpetually at war. They say they're at war. The party says they're at war, and one of the key elements of the book is that the government, which I'll refer to as the party in the video, they tell the population what's happening through these broadcasts from Big Brother, and Big Brother's like the face of the state, and every morning they watch these things from Big Brother, and Big Brother tells them how the war's going and who they're at war with, and it changes every few years, and it's massively contradictory. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but it's a fact, and that's a huge part of this book, that facts become state controlled. They are decided by the state. A fact is decided by the state. This is an element of the book that I think is the most relevant now, which I'll get to at the end, I think. But history is frequently and consistently rewritten by the state. And what they say had happened, or what they say is happening, is a fact. And any kind of dissension or argument or discussion or doubt about that gets punished severely. So you've got this sort of fearful population taking in what they know as fact, and a lot of them understand that it's contradictory, but they are conditioned into fear. But also there are a few elements that are also making that successful. So the propaganda is really huge with the Big Brother broadcasts, so that's a big thing. There's also a huge manipulation of language. So in 1984, the inner party, which only makes up 2% of the population, they control the language that's used. And there's this thing in the book called Newspeak, and Newspeak is where they edit and adjust the language. They take out words, they invent new words to limit the amount of discussion and discourse and political thought that you might have that might make you challenge what's happening. So that's a very important and effective way that the party limit political discussion in the book. And as far as the fear thing goes, there was a whole period of purges as well that the party made against dissidents and rebels, which if you lived in that time, then you would have known that had happened as well. So this is a huge amount of fear there as well. So there are 4 elements of the party, the government, and I think they're really interesting. They're kind of contradictory terms. So there's the Ministry of Peace, and the Ministry of Peace is the one in charge of the military and who they're at war with and that kind of thing. And I just think it's fantastic that that's called the Ministry of Peace. The Ministry of Love is the part of the organisation that's in charge of dissidents and rebels and basically putting people in line, making sure that everybody obeys the party, and that's the Ministry of Love. The Ministry of Truth is basically propaganda wing of the party, so that's a huge part of the success of this state. The Ministry of Truth and the Ministry of Plenty sorry, Rosie's just gone back mad then. And the Ministry of Plenty is the economic division of the party. So it's how they, it's the area of the party that divides up what resources everybody has and what kind of lifestyle they have. So the Ministry of Plenty, which I think is a very loaded word, I think. So those are the 4 areas of the government led by 2% of the population, and the proles, which are the sort of majority of the population, are passive elements of this government, of this political ideology. So clearly totalitarian, clearly fascist, clearly linked to Orwell's ideas about Hitler and Stalin. And I just want to go to this book here. So this is a book that I've been reading called Why I Write by George Orwell. And it's a really good book. It's definitely worth you getting out if you can. The front cover here says, political language is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable, and to give an appearance of solidity to pure wind. That's the thing at the front. So clearly has a lot of relevance here. And I just want to read something here where he talks about Hitler because here's my glasses. Because what he says about Hitler and his thoughts about what he thinks is going to happen or could happen if Hitler wins gives you a lot of insight into why he did this, I think. If Hitler wins this war, he will consolidate his rule over Europe, Africa and the Middle East. And if his armies have not been too greatly exhausted beforehand, he will wrench vast territories from Soviet Russia. He will set up a graded caste society in which the German master race will rule over Slavs and other lesser peoples whose job it will be to produce low-priced agricultural products. He will reduce the coloured peoples once and for all to outright slavery. The real quarrel of the fascist powers with British imperialism is that they know that it is disintegrating. Another 20 years along the present line of development, and India will be a peasant republic linked with England only by voluntary alliance. The semi-apes, of whom Hitler speaks with such loathing, will be flying aeroplanes and manufacturing machine guns. The fascist dream of a slave empire will be at an end. On the other hand, if we are defeated, we simply hand over our own victims to new masters who come fresh to the job and have not developed any scruples. But more is involved than the fate of the coloured peoples. 2 incompatible visions of life are fighting one another. Between democracy and totalitarianism, says Mussolini, there can be no compromise. The two creeds cannot even, for any length of time, live side by side. So long as democracy exists, even in its very imperfect English form, totalitarianism is in deadly danger. The whole English-speaking world is haunted by the idea of human equality, and though it would be simply a lie to say that either we or the Americans have ever acted up to our professions, still the idea is there, and it is capable of one day becoming a reality. From the English-speaking culture, if it does not perish, a society of free and equal human beings will ultimately arise. But it is precisely the idea of human equality that Hitler came into the world to destroy. He has, heaven knows, said so often enough. The thought of a world in which black men would be as good as white men and Jews treated as human beings brings him the same horror and despair as the thought of endless slavery brings to us. It is important to keep in mind how irreconcilable these two viewpoints are. Sometime within the next year, a pro-Hitler reaction within the left-wing intelligentsia is likely enough. There are preliminary signs of it already. Hitler's positive achievement appeals to the emptiness of these people, and in the case of those with pacifist leanings, to their masochism. One knows in advance more or less what they will say. They will start by refusing to admit that British capitalism is evolving into something different, or that the defeat of Hitler can mean any more than a victory for the British and American millionaires. And from that they will proceed to argue that after all, democracy is just the same as, or just as bad as, totalitarianism. There is not much freedom of speech in England. Therefore, there is no more than exists in Germany. To be on the dole is a horrible experience. Therefore, it is no worse than to be in the torture chambers of the Gestapo. In general, two blacks make a white. Half a loaf is the same as no bread. But in reality, whatever that may be true about democracy and totalitarianism, it is not true that they are the same. It would not be true even if British democracy were incapable of evolving beyond its present stage. The whole conception of the militarized continental state, with its secret police, its censored literature, and its conscript labour, is utterly different from that of the loose maritime democracy, with its slums and unemployment, its strikes and its party politics. It's a difference between land power and sea power, between cruelty and inefficiency, between lying and self-deception, between the SS man and the rent collector. And in choosing between them, one chooses not so much on the strength of what they know now, as of what they are capable of becoming. Yeah, I mean, this is brilliant, but it just shows you that because you can see that people are being apologist to some of these ideas, that he's worried about where the country could go, where the world could go, and he needs to make a statement against totalitarianism, which is what's happening here. So, the book centers around Winston Smith, and Winston Smith is a married man who works for the party, and he basically starts a love affair with Julia in the book, and it sort of sparks a bit of energy and life into his day-to-day routine, and it's kind of starts a bit odd actually. Some of the language in the first meeting with her, and some of the language in the interactions with her, I think, speak of a desperately suppressed and oppressed society where any kind of expression of love is frowned upon. So I think that's where it comes from. But it is not. It's odd the way it's written. It's got to be said. And anyway, they divulge this love affair that they're having and their doubts about the party to somebody that they know called O'Brien, who they think is also doubtful of the party, but he's kind of working undercover, if you like, or at least deceiving them, because he is actually one of the principal people in the party. He's really important in the party, and it all goes tits up. And Winston goes through this process of torture by the end of the book. I won't spoil if you haven't read it, although I've spoiled enough anyway. But yeah, it's quite horrific what he goes through. Really horrific. There's some bits of the book that are hard to read, I think, but it's really important because obviously this state has to be seen as oppressive, or the whole point is kind of lost a little bit. And there's a character in the book called Emmanuel Goldstein, who I think is a really interesting element to the book, because he's the writer that inspires the rebellion, or inspires rebellious intent, and some of the factions that are trying to fight against Big Brother. So Emmanuel Goldstein is clearly representative of people like Orwell, but more kind of political thinkers. Possibly Emma Goldman, but certainly through the years, there's been so many different writers you could reference that have helped to inspire people to fight against a oppressive regime. So he's an interesting character, because I think he gives that fuller picture, but he also gives that kind of sense of hope as well. And one thing I haven't mentioned yet, which I'll just mention here, is the idea of doublethink, which again I think is a really awesome bit of the book, which is when the two contradictory statements are put together to make some kind of slogan. The two most powerful ones I'm thinking about, there's lots of them, but I think war is peace is an interesting one, because it kind of sums up this idea that the party are constantly making the population think they're at war with different members, either Eurasia or East Asia, depending on what they want, and they'll change it, and it's to keep that sort of idea of loyalty and patriotism against the other. So war is peace is absolute genius. And also ignorance is strength. Ignorance is strength. And what I like about that is I can imagine some people arguing that that's a good point, but clearly more intelligent people would say knowledge is power, right? Knowledge is power. That's crucial. That is so important. That's why we want to learn about things. It's why curiosity matters so much. Ignorance is strength is directly opposed to the idea that knowledge is power. So yeah, an incredible use of language there. And that's the final point I'll make about language. The fact that the party edits and adjusts and replaces language is so important, and it's really important now. So I'll just sum up what I think the main points of 1984 are. So ultimately, it's a book about propaganda. It's a book about power and the delivery of information. It's a book about surveillance, because that also enters into it, as because they were constantly telling you, the party's telling you, the Big Brother is watching you. There's posters everywhere around the cities, and in the broadcast they are being watched as well. And individual freedom is clearly a very big theme in the book, and language and the impact of language. All of these things sum up George Orwell's fear and very real realization of totalitarianism. He knew that it was something that could easily happen. So we are now well past 1984, date-wise. We know it didn't happen in 1984, but there are elements of 1984 that we have that are familiar. They might not be exactly the same, but they are familiar. And I think that's the point here, that what makes 1984 so relevant is the themes that it covers and the warning that it gives. And in the post-internet age, the digital age, things have changed, and it's actually got a lot more this sort of postmodernist thing where every person can have access to all sorts of different information, and everybody's an expert, and everybody thinks an amalgamation of lots of different things, and truth is subjective. It's more scary than just a political party taking over a country and ruling over them. We are now in a position where political discourse is so difficult. It's so random, really. The language and truth, the language we use, and the way that the language is received, and the way that truth is doubted, and how subjective truth is, has made any kind of political discussion completely chaotic. On a public forum like this, it's it's an invitation for just random comments that make no effect on the discussion and doesn't move the discussion forward. In reality, like in a pub situation, say you're all sitting there around the table having a discussion in a pub, you'll get somebody saying one thing and saying, yeah, but that's a fact, and someone else saying, no, that's a fact. And they've used the internet to find out their information, and both things are officially a fact, and they contradict each other. And it's so interesting that, I mean, it's interesting and scary and horrible that the information highway, there was this sort of golden age of freedom, has muddied the political discourse like crazy. And it's not that surprising that you get these conspiracy theorists that don't believe half of what they see in the media because they're aware that the media is subjective, but then that means that they believe bizarre things and they don't trust anybody, they don't trust any government or scientists or it's created. There are these extremely paranoid people that are using the availability of information to champion crazy information or crazy conspiracies or crazy theorists. But the problem is, it's very difficult to disprove those people and those facts when everything is a fact. Everything is provable, and that's the problem now. That language and truth, which are huge elements of this book, language and truth have now become completely chaotic. So, in some ways, some of 1984 has come true. The surveillance thing is also kind of true because we use the internet so much for what we do, and they are tracking everything we do on the internet all the time. So we're being watched in that sense as well. So you could argue that the server engines are Big Brother as well. Yeah. So George Orwell might have been writing something that was depicting a different kind of world to what he would see now if he was here now, but it's very similar. But I need to clarify this. It is similar. There are some things that are familiar and have some similarities, but I can't end with that because it is really important that we do maintain the attitude that he had against fascism and against totalitarianism, because I agree with him personally. The democratic socialism is the only ideology that makes sense. But ultimately, even if you're a capitalist and you believe in democratic capitalism, and some of my close friends do, the political discourse is important. It's important to have a difference. If you're a democratic capitalist, then you're not a fascist. You're not a someone who believes in dictatorship. And we need to make sure that dictators aren't supported and aren't justified in our language, in our arguments, because whatever political part you play in the political spectrum, dictatorship is wrong and totalitarianism is wrong, and it's important what Orwell was doing when he was making a statement against that. So here we go. That's my video on 1984. If you haven't read it, it's absolutely incredible. It's got some odd moments, like I said, with his relationship with Winston's relationship with Julia. But there's so many ideas in it. It's so important. It's definitely worth you reading it, because obviously you've probably heard a lot about it, and it's got a really interesting ending, which I'm not going to spoil. It's got some horrible bits in it, which are important for the impact of the book. It's genius. So there we are. Thanks for watching. Please comment below on what you think of the book, and stay curious, everybody. It keeps us free.
Picture of what it's like to be